Today I will give you an answer. Should you get a lens which is made for an APS-C sensor camera and mount it on top of a full frame camera or not? In this case we have two Sony cameras, the ZV-E10, which is my small vlogging camera, and for this camera I bought the 11mm 1.8, of which you can see the review on my channel obviously. Then I have the Sony Alpha 7 Mark IV, and I came to the idea, well, I do have already a wide angle lens. So what is going to happen if I attach this lens on my full frame camera to save some money instead of buying the 20mm 1.8, which gives me less focal length, same aperture, but it costs $400 more. The same also applies to other manufacturers, for instance Canon. Canon has EFS lenses and EF lenses. EF lenses are made for full frame cameras, while the EFS lenses are made for APS-C sensor cameras, like the 80 or the 90D. While EF lenses are made for the Canon EOS 5D Mark II, Mark III or Mark IV. Well, in this case, we have one factor that may play a role in your life, and that is the cost factor. For the 11mm you pay around $500, while you pay around $900 for the 20mm. So you have less focal length, same aperture, but you pay more. Does it make sense? Well, there is one point. One lens is made for APS-C sensor cameras, for instance like the Sony Alpha 6000, 6300 or 6600, and that is the 11mm. So this lens is specifically made for cameras which have an APS-C sensor inside. While the 20mm is made for full frame cameras such as the Alpha 7 Mark IV or the A7S Mark III or the A7R Mark V. If we compare both sensors with each other, we notice that the sensor size of the ZV-E10 is the same as on the Alpha 6000, for instance, and that is an APS-C sensor, which is much smaller when we compare just the surfaces than the sensor that the A7 IV uses. And since it has a much smaller surface, we see also a smaller cutout while we attach any lens on the smaller sensor. In simple words, that is called the crop factor. So it crops in while we attach a lens on this camera. The crop factor on Sony cameras is 1.5. So any lens that you attach on an APS-C sensor camera, you need to multiply that by 1.5. To keep it simple, if we have a 100mm and you attach a 100mm to the Sony Alpha 6000, for instance, you will see a cutout as if you were using a 150mm, since we multiplied 100 times 1.5. If you use a Canon camera, the crop factor is 1.6. So if we use the 11mm on this ZV-E10 times 1.5, that is simple, it's 165, if you put the comma just before the 5, is 16.5mm. So once you take a photo, keep that in mind, you actually see what you would see on a full frame camera if you were using a 16.5mm lens. If we would use now the 20mm, which is designed for full frame cameras, and use it on the ZV-E10, we also need to multiply that by 1.5. That means 20 times 1.5 gives us 30mm. So we see basically just the cutout that we would see with a 30mm lens. If we compare both lens mounts with each other, you see that you have such a small hole on the 11mm, while you have a bigger hole on the 20mm, so it looks more like a small film. However, both lenses are made for the E-mount, so you can use both lenses on either camera since they both have the Sony E-mount. So now we come to the important question. Would you invest $400 more for the 20mm, or would you go for the 11mm and take the crop factor into account and spend less on the lens? Well, that is now the question. So first of all, you're gonna save some money, and you are saving also a small bit of weight Both lenses are not that heavy, but the 11mm is slightly lighter than the 20mm. So let's try out something. I'm using now this full frame camera, the Sony Alpha 7 Mark IV. With the 11mm, I recognize my spot where I'm standing. And now I'm gonna take a picture. I'm gonna take that in RAW. And it says on the upper left side, I can take another 8,049 photos using this settings here, on this location, this camera, this file format, and this lens. I'm standing on the same spot, same camera, same settings, different lens though. It's now the 20mm. And let me take a photo now. And what I now recognized is that I can only take another 3,420 photos. Same settings, same file format, same camera, same spot, different lens. Why is that? If you go into your cameras menu, there's a point that says APS-C S35. If I turn this on, I'm still standing here at the same spot. I see a different view or a cutout of the image. And now, again, I can take another 8,046 photos. So more than double than if I would leave this point to auto. Why is that? With this point, the camera automatically recognizes if the lens, which is attached to the camera, is designed for that sensor. So if I'm gonna take now the 11mm on this camera, the camera recognizes that this lens is actually made for APS-C sensor cameras. Then it switches into the APS-C mode, which gives me a different cutout of the image, but now the important part, with less resolution. This camera has 33 megapixels. If I use now a lens which is designed for the APS-C sensor, like the 11mm, I only have a resolution of 14 megapixels because I can't use the entire sensor surface. While using a lens which is designed for full frame cameras like the 20mm, it gives me a full readout of the 33 megapixels since it doesn't crop in. And that's the reason why I can take now less photos, because a higher resolution takes more memory, so I can take less photos. So you're probably not going to buy a camera such as the A7R Mark V to use a lens on it, which is designed for APS-C sensor cameras, since you can't read out all the megapixels that this camera has. Just for photo mode, if you need megapixels, then you should get a lens which is designed for your camera. If you don't need all the megapixels, you can still get the lens which is designed for APS-C sensor cameras and use it on a full frame camera to save some money and probably some weight as well. I can also use the 11mm lens on my Sony A7 IV for filming. Now we come to the important question. Will I get the full resolution, for instance 4K? Well, you take 3,840 times 2,160, which is 4K, and you get 8.3 megapixels. And since we figured out that after taking a photo, we still get an image with 14 megapixels, and now we know that we only require 8.3 megapixels to get a 4K video, you can record yourself in 4K using this lens, save some money, save some weight, and you still get a nice and decent blur background on this super wide angle lens. Keep in mind you still get the crop factor, so you are using not an 11mm on this camera, you're using now a 16.5mm, but still with a good aperture. However, if you have a Sony Alpha 7S Mark III that has only 12 megapixels and you're attaching now this 11mm lens, it still crops in and you're not getting a 4K video anymore. The 11mm lens now attached to a full frame camera, and as you can see you still get a lot of background to show your audience where you are, on vacation, for your vlogging trips or whatever, and you still can record yourself in 4K. This is now 4K 25 frames per second. Here's now the 20mm on this full frame camera. As you can see, it's a little bit less background since we have 3.5mm less, and I'm now recording myself in 4K 25 using its internal microphone of this Sony A7 Mark IV. If I would use the simulated crop factor on this 20mm lens, as you can see, I would get now a 30mm, and that's how it looks like on a full frame camera. So I hope you understand what I meant. If you have any open questions, leave a comment below. Anytime you need full resolution, get a lens which is designed for your camera. If not, get a cheaper lens, save some money, probably some weight as well. If you like that video, make sure to subscribe. You get the lenses, the camera, using the link provided in the video description below. See you very soon und tschüss.